Good afternoon. Before I begin, I do want to say that I know that when I go to my classroom, and when I begin the beginning of the day, I oftentimes think of what I can teach my students, but I want to talk to you today about perhaps what our students might be able to teach us. I want to talk to you about the teacher as a learner. As a former science teacher, I know all about potential energy, momentum, the law of conservation of energy, and gravity. And there will be a tutoring session for those concepts for some of you over in that corner afterwards. However, as the son of two school teachers, there was something that I knew with absolute certainty as I was growing up, and that is that I would never, ever be a teacher. A few years and a couple of degrees later, and I find myself doing the very thing that is the antithesis of everything that I thought was cool when I myself was in the educational system. In my first couple of years as a teacher, I taught at two different schools. I coached soccer, I coached wrestling, I taught 8th grade math, earth space science, life science, speech, ancient literature, business, research skills, and one of those random elective classes that nobody really knows exactly what it is. So soon I began to wish that I hadn't given up that planning period. I learned that in order to be good at my job, I had to constantly be growing. I had to constantly increase and develop my skills. I had to continue to be a learner. After such crazy scheduling, numerous preps, and several mid-year class changes, I finally found a groove in my third year of teaching, settling into a mere 2 preps and science classes that I love to teach. I was somewhat hesitant when my principal called me into his office to ask if I would be willing to teach AVID at our school, which is a national demonstration school. My initial response was that of what I felt any good employee should say, and so I told him, "Anything you need from me, boss." But my initial thought was somewhat different. I thought to myself, bring on the pain. As a science teacher and mechanical engineer, I can tell you all about scientific concepts and interactions, but all I knew about AVID was that at our school it was a big deal and that the letter A stood for advancement. So I buried myself into learning everything about my new subject because after my meeting with my principal in the middle of October, I had exactly 1 week to prepare for my new AVID classes. Thankfully, we have a fantastic coordinator, Ms. Krangle, and an excellent leadership team, and they helped me to prepare for these new classes. So I started to learn as I went along, and my science vocabulary was soon replaced with a new active vocabulary with terms such as philosophical chairs, Socratic seminars, tutorials, and weeks at a glance. Until AVID, wicker to me was a word that I had reserved for a picnic basket or a chair. So AVID forced me to continue to be a learner. As a full-time AVID elective teacher at a national demonstration school, I have a steady flow of walkthroughs and classroom observations. However, these new types of observations were a little bit different than a single administrator quietly scribbling my every flaw on the back of the classroom. These walkthroughs were of groups. No, they were hordes of teachers, board members, principals, and veteran administrators that could have quite possibly been my parents. And I was supposed to model something for them. My first walkthrough was on my first day of tutorials. Oh, the joy. And so to prepare for my visitors, I had to continue to be a learner. However, after I started to ease into a groove of tutorials and fun Fridays, I was able to open my eyes and see that in core classes, I could see learning gains. In my AVID classes, I could see life gains. I watched as the students began to open up to one another and myself, and I was able to coach them in their goals for the futures. I showed them how easy it is to get financial aid for college when you keep your grades up, and I facilitated their learning on college campus field trips and tours. Team building games, which to me felt silly at first, led to greater discussions about beliefs, dreams, aspirations, and the consequences of actions. As an AVID teacher, I don't have an AVID benchmark exam to give at the absolute least convenient time of every quarter. It's somewhat more difficult to assess a student's learning gains in the areas of college readiness and self-motivation than it is to assess if they understand what Ohm's law is. Before AVID, I thought my job as a teacher was to teach. As an AVID teacher, I feel it's my job to coach. Yes, students must know the curriculum, but more importantly, they need to have a purpose and a direction for their lives. A middle school student is like a person, an angry person, driving a semi-truck while blindfolded. So as these angry little people drive this semi truck, I felt that as a content area teacher, I was merely pouring fuel into a vehicle that was headed nowhere at best and disaster at worst. As an AVID teacher, I can at least help them remove the blindfold. It was difficult as a content area teacher to help guide them when I only had time to fuel them up with information. As an AVID teacher, directing them and guiding them is my primary purpose. This is the most rewarding part of being an AVID teacher, knowing that I can coach them in their life and guide them through their rough, emotionally driven middle school years. And so I continue to be a learner. I teach in a school that is surrounded by poverty. My students fear getting jumped after school and try to avoid the streets where the gangs like to hang out. A large percentage of my students were born in other countries, and many just recently learned to speak English. I have political refugees from Bosnia, Cuba, and the Middle East in my AVID classes. I have found that a common trait within many of my students is that their parents didn't go to college, their parents don't care if they go to college, and some of the parents don't even want their students to go to middle school. A large percentage of my students have family and friends that are incarcerated. Many don't know both of their parents, and quite a few have to avoid gang activity on the way home. My AVID class has become a place where students can gather around one another to help each other pursue excellence in the middle of a culture that has them fighting upstream. I've taught hundreds of students over the past several years, but didn't know too many of their stories. As I get to know my AVID family, I now realize the tremendous obstacles that my students are faced with every single day. And as I do my best to foster this family, I can watch my students learn as I also continue to be a learner. So after this past year's trek, I now realize that I have a lot to learn, and I'm still learning. And the scientific concepts that I taught just a year ago are still with me, just in a different form. I am potential energy, but I'm aiming towards kinetic. I am momentum, but I am gradually accelerating. I not only conserve energy, but I focus and refine it. I teach my students to grow towards their dreams like two celestial bodies drawn in this force that we call gravity. And so while I am a teacher, I'm also a learner. And while today I will continue to be a learner, tomorrow I'll lead. Thank you.